parents who psychologically abuse adult children. Many parents psychologically abuse their adult children with emotional manipulation, criticism and comparisons. These invisible dynamics can eat away at the well-being of the men and women who continue to depend on their parents. There are many parents who psychologically abuse adult children with manipulation, blackmail, hurtful words and comments that feed insecurities from childhood. The passage of time does not guarantee that harmful childhood attachments will be broken or repaired. Sometimes they continue into adulthood, negatively affecting well-being and self-esteem. Mental abuse comes in many forms and can affect anyone. Some children abuse their elderly parents, some parents abuse their young children, and some independent men and women even continue to be abused by their father, mother or both parents. What to do in these cases? It often seems useless to reach out to the social services or other organizations that deal with these kinds of issues for the adults who have problems with abuse. What's the point of trying to fix something you've been dealing with since you were a kid? Many victims of psychological abuse do not believe that it is possible to change their situation. They have surrendered themselves to their situation and they are still in contact with the abusive parent. One thing is clear, an abusive parent and their child always have a bond. A connection that feeds addiction, fear and even love. It is a harmful form of love, obviously poisoned by the addict. Unfortunately, these situations are common, can easily become chronic. Parents who psychologically abuse adult children. Mental abuse is any behavior that seeks to control or oppress another person through fear, manipulation, humiliation, intimidation, projection of guilt, coercion, and constant disapproval. Although this type of aggression may not leave physical marks, it affects psychological integrity. For example, their influence on a child's mind can be devastating. When this kind of abuse goes on for decades, you can probably imagine the consequences. It has a huge impact on basic aspects such as self-esteem, identity and personal safety, among other things. This type of abuse does not begin when the victim is an adult. It has always had roots in behavior that started during the victim's childhood. This explains why many people reach adulthood with heavy emotional baggage. In fact, a lifetime of psychological abuse can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. A notable aspect of this type of abuse is the extraordinary effort people make to pretend that everything is normal. It is very rare that family members and friends, even the close ones, know anything about the abuse. The circumstances remain hidden and as intensely guarded. When the monsters are your parents, normalizing mental abuse. As we have mentioned above, there are many parents who abuse their children psychologically. The first question that may pop into your mind is why this is happening. How can people cope with these terrible circumstances? Wouldn't it be better for these people to cut ties with these abusive parents? However, it is never that simple. The connection between a victim and an abuser is incredibly complex. Sometimes, despite the terrible circumstances marked by anxiety, fear, humiliation, contempt, you can still love someone who hurts you. After all, it is one's parent. If you have not known of another parent-child relationship, then this behavior may seem normal. Therefore, adult children continue to find themselves in the abuse and vacillate between love, fear, care and hatred. Their abusive parents do not change their behavior just because their child has grown up. Contempt, criticism, humiliation, emotional manipulation continue to be useful in controlling and exercising power. The passage of time does not turn monsters into angels. They continue to use power and control, because it is part of their personality. What is the effect of this psychological abuse? One of the consequences of emotional and psychological abuse that starts during childhood is post-traumatic stress disorder. Social studies from Utrecht University and the University of Coimbra in Portugal have shown the importance of this relationship. Therefore, psychological abuse that continues into adulthood tends to have the following consequences. Problematic and unsatisfactory emotional relationships. Low self-esteem, feelings of worthlessness, damaged pride, feelings of insecurity, lack of motivation, etc. Emotional repression, the tendency to hide emotions. Anxiety, stress, sleep disorders, etc. Is there a way out when parents abuse their adult children psychologically? Although these kinds of situations often seem hopeless, there are ways to get out of an abusive relationship. To begin with, the adult needs to be fully aware of the abuse and be dedicated to addressing it. This is easier said than done because addiction is common in relationships with abuse. There is not only emotional dependence, but also financial dependence. Many adults in this situation cannot leave their parents' home because they are not financially independent. However, this does not mean that it is easy to break these abusive ties if you are financially stable. They are very hard to break because of the abuser's constant manipulation and criticism. The victim has to firmly believe that his or her situation is unsustainable and needs to change. Therefore, there are only two options. Dismiss the abusive parents and completely cut ties with them or significantly reduce communication. Likewise, children of abusive parents also need psychological help. Decades of humiliation and suffering leave a very deep wound that needs to heal. The goal for them is to regain their self-esteem, personal security and rebuild their lives so that they can be independent and happy. Situations with abuse. Why is it so hard to get out? The victims in these violent situations of abuse may end up blaming themselves for the violence they suffer. This can make it difficult for them to get out of the relationship. Situations of abuse are still a big problem in our daily lives. We often read about women who have been murdered by their partners or ex-partners because they could not escape their abusive relationships. Sometimes people attack their former partners, yet the victim goes back to them again and again. Or they never manage to get out of the relationship. Why? This is something that is hard for many people to understand, and they like to blame the victim. It is common to hear, if he has hurt you so much, why are you going back or staying with him? The reality is not so simple. These women are not actually guilty. In fact, there are many reasons why it is difficult to leave an abusive situation. Keep reading to learn why and maybe help someone in situations of abuse. Read 5 Types of Verbal Aggression. This irrational need to determine, control and have power over another person is the main reason that leads to domestic violence. Luis Rogers Marcos. Emotional dependence and abuse. When you are in a relationship, you need to feel loved by the other person. So how do we define emotional addiction? It is an extreme need for love from the partner that gives birth to the other person's obsessions and constant feelings of abandonment. This can cause a woman to behave submissively so that she does not lose her partner. She ends up prioritizing her partner above everything and everyone, including herself, and idealizes him. This leads her to focus only on his good qualities, although there aren't many, and cover up his cruelty and aggression. She also accepts the aggressive partner's belief that he is the superior one. This ties into the fear of breaking up. That fear then causes separation anxiety, which causes the victim to think that the worst that can happen is that the relationship will end and she will end up alone. So she does everything she can to prevent this. This goes deeper if the abuse is consistent. because the aggressive partner often feels upset and tries to make amends with the damage he has caused. We fear violence less than our feelings. Personal, private, lonely pain is scarier than what anyone else can inflict. Jim Morrison. It's my fault. The victims in these violent situations of abuse may end up blaming themselves for the violence they suffer. In the mindset where a woman assumes that her partner is kind and caring, there is no room to accept his violent behavior. So when that happens, the victim looks for a reason and usually sees themselves as the reason. Therefore, these women do not see themselves as victims, but instead feel guilty or responsible. What happens is that the relationship has terrible, scary aggression, then good moments that give a sense of relief. In this scenario, the victim will usually do everything to do the latter more often. She will do it, even if it means she ends up burying herself deeper and deeper. See also, 9 signs of psychological manipulation through words. Other reasons why women stay in situations of abuse. There is another factor that stops a victim from leaving an abusive relationship: low self-esteem. She sees herself as someone who can't do things right or as a worthless person. This is something that the abuser tells her. "You're worthless" is a frequent phrase when it comes to verbal abuse. But the abuser does not just use physical or psychological violence against his victim. It is also common for a man to get rid of a woman's social support. This isolation makes her even more dependent on the abused. The ultimate goal of this strategy is to ensure that the victim has no one to talk to or ask for help. Another form of abuse is learned helplessness. Little by little, the victim begins to lose much of her power and freedom, so she ends up believing that there's nothing she can do to escape. Then desperation takes over and she won't be able to see a way out. Abuse is any behavior designed to control and/or subjugate another person through the use of fear, humiliation, and verbal or physical abuse. Susan Forward. Everything you should know about alcohol abuse. Consuming alcohol in excessive amounts is a major problem that can become a disorder if a consumer meets a number of criteria. However, this disorder has a solution. Alcohol is an addictive psychoactive substance that many cultures have used for decades. A harmful intake of this substance, however, entails a social and economic burden for society. Several mental disorders are associated with its consumption. One of them of alcohol abuse. Scientists have recently established a link between a harmful intake of alcohol and infectious diseases such as tuberculosis and HIV. On the other hand, if a pregnant woman consumes alcohol, it can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome and prenatal complications. As you can see, alcohol can cause great problems to the person who consumes it uncontrollably. The problem of consuming alcohol irresponsibly. Alcohol consumption is an underlying factor in more than 200 diseases and disorders. It is related to the risk of developing mental health problems, such as alcoholism. Likewise, there are other, important, non-communicable diseases, such as cirrhosis of the liver, some forms of cancer, cardiovascular diseases, related to an uncontrolled intake, injuries and traffic accidents. Furthermore, alcohol plays a major role in the development of disorders that many people suffer from. Alcohol abuse. The disorder is defined as a group of behavioral and psychological symptoms, such as withdrawal, tolerance, and an intense desire to consume. Symptoms that occur from 4 to 12 hours after no alcohol has been consumed, followed by prolonged intense alcohol intake, are characterized as alcohol withdrawal. Since withdrawal can be very unpleasant, people may continue to consume alcohol to avoid or alleviate the withdrawal. Some of the symptoms can last for months and can lead to relapse. When there is a repetitive and intense pattern of consumption, people with alcohol abuse can end up spending a lot of time obtaining alcohol and consuming it. On the other hand, after consuming comparable amounts of alcohol continuously, its effectiveness decreases. As a consequence, the person must consume more alcohol in order to experience the effect that they are used to. This loss of sensitivity, and the need to increase the amount of alcohol, characterizes tolerance, when it becomes an unstoppable desire to drink alcohol. It is easy to prove a person's intense desire to consume alcohol when their dire need to drink alcoholic beverages keeps them from thinking about anything else. In other words, alcoholics begin to focus only on drinking. As a consequence, their academic performance and work performance begin to deteriorate. This is either due to the effects of alcohol or because you are drunk at school or at work. Other consequences include neglecting their children, if they have any, their relatives or friends, as well as their domestic duties. Furthermore, they tend to drop out of school or quit their jobs. The individuals may start consuming alcohol under dangerous circumstances, while driving a car or operating machinery. They know what they are doing is risky. They are aware that it can cause significant problems on a physical, psychological and social level. However, they don't care and they continue with their actions. How is alcohol abuse diagnosed? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, establishes a series of criteria to diagnose this disorder. Let's see what they entail. A problematic pattern of alcohol consumption that causes clinically significant impairment or distress and manifests itself in at least 2 of the following criteria over a 12-month period. Alcohol is often consumed in larger quantities or over longer periods than intended. There is a persistent desire or unsuccessful effort to cut down or control alcohol consumption. A large proportion of time is spent on activities necessary to obtain alcohol, consume alcohol or recover from its effects. Craving, or a strong desire or urge to consume alcohol. Recurrent alcohol consumption, resulting in not being able to fulfill important duties at work, school or home. And continuous alcohol use, despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems, caused or exacerbated by the effects of alcohol. Important social, employment or leisure activities are given up or reduced due to alcohol consumption. Recurrent alcohol consumption in situations where it is physically dangerous. Alcohol consumption is continued, despite the knowledge that it has persistent or recurring physical or psychological problems that are probably caused by or exacerbated by alcohol. Tolerance, as defined by one of the following, as a need for a markedly increased amount of alcohol to achieve intoxication or the desired effect. B. A markedly decreased effect with continuous consumption of the same amount of alcohol. Withdrawals, manifested by one of the following, as the characteristic alcohol withdrawal syndrome. B. Alcohol, or a closely related substance such as benzodiazepine, is consumed to relieve or avoid withdrawal symptoms. A problem with a solution. Alcohol abuse is usually associated with the same problems that come from the consumption of other substances, such as cannabis, cocaine, heroin, amphetamines, tranquilizers, hypnotics or anxiolytics. These are the risk factors. The constant consumption, drinking alcohol regularly, or in large quantities, can create addiction or any other problem related to this substance. Age. People who consume alcohol in high doses at an early age are at greater risk of suffering from alcohol abuse. Family history. The risk of suffering from alcohol abuse is greater in those whose relatives or parents also have problems with alcohol. Depression or mental health problems. Some mental disorders, such as depression and anxiety, are related to problems with alcohol and other substances. Social and cultural factors. Social relationships, along with a person's environment and culture, can increase the risk of suffering from alcohol abuse. On the other hand, some people may also consume alcohol to alleviate unwanted effects from other substances. If they cannot consume the substance they usually consume, because it is not available at the moment, they may use alcohol as a substitute. Consuming alcohol in excessive amounts is a major problem that can become a disorder if the consumer meets a number of criteria. However, this disorder has a solution. The best recommendation is to see a specialist. Professionals are able to explain the different types of treatments that are available, as well as which treatment best suits the individual person's circumstances. Lenore Walker's cycle of abuse. To create her theory, Lenore Walker used the statements of battered women. Lenore Walker's cycle of abuse theory states that there are 3 phases in all abusive relationships. This researcher psychologist has studied this form of abuse for over 40 years. He believes that it is possible to eliminate abuse. He also helps abused women defend themselves and fight for justice. According to Walker, victims do not disclose their abuser publicly because they are afraid. They are afraid that things will get worse, especially when they are financially dependent on their abuser. Walker has contributed a very useful tool to the psychology behind gender violence. This tool enables us to understand how abused women suffer. Walker also helps us understand how difficult it is for battered women to leave their abuser. He published the conclusions of his theory in 1979. To create his theory, he used the statements of battered women. Through her research, Walker found that these women are not attacked at the same time or in the same way. However, the phases are the same. Although some phases may last long or manifest themselves in different ways, they always appear clearly. He established a comparable pattern of behavior in all situations of abuse, and he observed how these patterns of behavior recur in a cycle. In this way, Walker's cycle of abuse helps us understand relationships with abuse. Recent research explains that it is almost impossible to break out of this cycle of abuse, as it is almost impossible to escape. The consequences for the victim of violence are serious. The outcome can sometimes be fatal. Gender violence involves the loss of personhood. This loss includes biological, psychological, and social factors. Cycle of abuse, phases of abuse. Here, we will talk about Walker's cycle of abuse. This is one of the most widely held theories about the stages of an abusive relationship. Phase, with build-up of tensions. In this phase, there is a gradual escalation of tensions. Walker characterized this by an occurrence of continuous problems and violent acts. This phase does not necessarily have a specific duration. It can last for weeks, months, or years. Throughout this phase, there are instances involving jealousy, yelling, or petty arguments. The victim interprets these insults and verbal abuse as isolated incidents that are under control. The addict experiences sudden mood swings and becomes angry over insignificant things. They are often tense or irritable. The victim tries to mitigate the circumstances. They don't want to make things worse. They believe that if they try to make the abused fall down, it will end in a conflict. The victim tends to blame himself for what is happening and justify the abused's behavior. Every time there is a case of minor aggression, the tension will increase in the addict. The apparent passivity of the victim worsens the condition of the abuser, who makes no attempt to control his emotions. Acute violence. This is the shortest of the 3 phases. Violence breaks out at this stage. There is a lack of control which causes the physical, psychological and/or sexual violence to occur. The victim experiences distrust and anxiety, and they feel like isolating themselves. They may feel powerless over what has happened. They usually wait several days before seeking help. The phase of reconciliation or wheat bread days. In this phase, the abuser usually asks for forgiveness and promises the victim that it will never happen again. They use manipulative strategies to make sure the relationship doesn't end. When the victim accepts gifts, invitations, or promises, this does nothing but reinforce the abusive behavior. The tension that built up and the phase of acute violence has disappeared. In this phase, it is difficult for the woman to report the situation they are going through. The sudden change in attitude makes them believe that it was a one-off and that it will never happen again. The victim wants to believe that the abuser will never do anything like this again. The fact that the addict seems calm reinforces the belief that they can change. Their loving behavior is proof of this. This reconciliation phase ends as soon as small incidents begin again. Any time during the day and night is good enough to say enough or end a stage in your life you wished you hadn't lived through. Raymond D. Penafla. How can you break a cycle of abuse? To break the cycle of abuse, the victim must be aware of their situation. From this point, the victim